Your brain is working right now, but do you know how it's working? Billions of tiny neurons are traveling and sending messages throughout your body by way of the nervous system, storing important information for later and throwing out information that you don't need. Some of these stored messages affect you without your knowledge, and they can cause major differences in the way you operate, creating love, hate, lust, fear, virtually any emotion within a fraction of a second.
A Russian physiologist called Ivan Pavlov explained these phenomena, naming his theory classical conditioning. His work opened doors to examine and analyze hidden links between our physical and mental states, delving into the unconscious before Freud's time. Pavlov examined a part of our brains which associates an unrelated object or sensation to an expressed emotion, which can even affect our physical state. This unlocks a part of us which holds the power to enhance or exploit the marvel of the human brain.
Pavlov was born on September 26, 1849, in the small Russian town of Yesel. The son of a local minister, young Ivan grew up the eldest of 11 siblings, 6 of whom died during childhood. Pavlov was an extremely capable child. His grandfather is credited with encouraging the young Ivan to record, review, and organize his observations when studying, a method which later aided him in being a diligent, careful observer and analyst.
Expected to follow in the footsteps of his father, Pavlov dealt with issues involving identity. Does he follow the vocation of God or the vocation of science? To the expense of his father's happiness, he decided to enroll in St. Petersburg State University in 1870. Here he was recognized for his curiosity, passion for learning, and even awarded with a gold medal for his discoveries in physiology within his first course. Pavlov continued to the Academy of Medical Surgery to take his third course. He won another gold medal for more work in physiology during this time. Pavlov's work really began skyrocketing at this point, when he was recognized by the Institute of Experimental Medicine and, within 5 years of employment, took on an administrative position. The institute is where his most famous and influential experiments took place.
Now, what does digestion have to do with psychology? Plenty, as it turns out. Pavlov's most famous experiment, later becoming known as classical conditioning, has to do with the association of a neutral stimulant to an active stimulant. This experiment was conducted when Pavlov would ring a bell, and when he rang this bell, a dog would be exposed to meat powder. After repeating this sequence and measuring the dog's secretion of saliva, Pavlov would ring the bell but would not present meat powder. Surely enough, the dog secreted saliva despite not being exposed to the powder. This experiment proved that associating the neutral stimulant, the bell, with the active stimulant, the powder, transformed the neutral stimulant into an active stimulant, both psychologically and physiologically. Not only did the dog salivate after the first bell without the meat powder, but the dog continued this salivation pattern over long periods of time.
What is classical conditioning?
So classical conditioning has developed into a theory that came out of what Pavlov did originally, and it's a theory that says that we learn everything by associating two stimuli in the environment. And so the fact that we've associated stimuli in the environment elicits behavior on our part.
What were the findings or results from his experiments?
The findings when he worked with his dogs involved showing that the brain of any creature could form an association or a connection with something else that occurred at about the same time. So he wanted the dogs to salivate, salivate in response to food, but the dogs would start salivating when they heard the footsteps of the person bringing the food. That's what got him thinking about this and testing it. And so he built a number of contraptions and a number of different things, like a bell, like a music box, a light going on and off. These were all paired with or connected with the food in the dog's mind, and so even without the food they would start salivating. And so again, this is the first really scientific kind of psychology that was put on the map. He could turn a behavior on and he could turn it off. And from a scientific perspective, that's the ultimate, that's the gold standard. If you can turn something on and off when you want to, not just when it happens.
Pavlov's work began its decline around 1907 when he began openly voicing his opposition to the communist movement in Russia, where he studied and was governmentally funded. The conflict between Pavlov and the government, specifically between the physiologist and Lenin, spiked in 1922 when Pavlov requested that his laboratory be moved overseas. This request was denied, and Pavlov's reputation became tainted, leaving him little room to advocate against the Communist Party. His public opinionating came to a close in the early 1930s, the cause believed by many being that his funding was threatened and because Pavlov's desire to explore classical conditioning's correlation with psychosis was in turn threatened as well.
Introducing the idea of classical conditioning in humans, however, inspired psychologists of the future to conduct similar experiments, the most famous of which being the Little Albert experiment. Dr. John B. Watson published his findings in 1920, which reinforced Pavlov's ideas and put them into in-depth human context. Watson conditioned little Albert, whose real name was Thomas, to fear ferns. In the beginning of the experiment, Albert was introduced to things which emitted a positive response: a monkey, a dog, a white rat, and a rabbit. Watson then paired the introduction of the white rat with a loud clang, which scared Albert. From then on, Albert began to scream and cry when exposed to the animals. The same response occurred when Albert was returned after a month at home.
How did Pavlov lead to the Little Albert experiment?
John Watson was an American psychologist at the same time, and Pavlov's experiments were translated into English, and Watson read them, and at that time American psychology was trying to establish itself as a science. And so when Watson read Pavlov, he saw there something very scientific, something very measurable, something that they could repeat. And so he thought that conditioning was going to be psychology, and started thinking through how we could get from what Pavlov had established to all these other kinds of psychological phenomena.
Results from the Little Albert experiment.
There's the ethical part, because Watson wanted to move beyond the dogs, and so he read Pavlov's experiments, thought that he could use the environment to train a child to do or be anything. One side of the ethics was really good. Watson was living at a time when something called eugenics was really popular, which essentially said we want to screen out all the bad genes and screen in all the good genes in our population. Good genes meaning white, middle class, Protestant, and so forth. And so their arguments were based on genetics. You know, everything's about genetics. Intelligence is about genetics, eye color is about genetics, everything else is about genetics. Watson said, no, it's not just about genetics, it's about the environment. And so his Little Albert experiments were about proving that it's not all genes. I can change the environment and change the child.
Thanks to Watson's unethical yet revealing experiment and Pavlov's theory, we now know that classical conditioning explains the behaviors of abuse victims or people with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, disorders like these are treatable. Many more discoveries were supported by classical conditioning, including the basis of development of phobias, especially the most common like aquaphobia, arachnophobia, and acrophobia. They usually refer to a negative experience.
I would describe him as very precise. He was into measurements down to the smallest detail. He was completely dedicated. Even when he didn't have enough money for food, he was still doing his scientific experiments. And he was very patient because he had to go through a lot of very difficult times.
Pavlov's work is, in closing, completely due to his curiosity since a young age. His insatiable passion for learning and spreading knowledge brought us to a modern understanding not of what we think, but of what makes us think. He opened up new doors of psychology, proving that it can be tested and measured physically. He didn't just discover the theory. His diligent and careful methods of study set the foundation for a new era of psychology. Pavlov once said, "While you are experimenting, do not remain content with the surface of things."